Here's the really cool thing. Go and fact check me for those of you who don't want to tell me this is true. Last 2 chapters of the book of Revelation, it says this when it describes John the Revelator, who gets caught up in the third heaven on the island of Patmos. He is writing his description of heaven, and he's describing the things that he is seeing. And he says there's a gate made of pearl, but it's as clear as crystal. That's what he says, clear as crystal. Then he keeps walking and he sees the streets of gold. He says, but the gold is clear as crystal. He sees a sea of glass, but it itself is also clear as crystal. Go and fact check me on this. Everything he describes, shortly thereafter, he calls it clear as crystal. And it's as if all of heaven knows not even to get in the way of you seeing what heaven is actually all about, because heaven is all about Jesus. That's why Revelation also says the Lamb is its light, right? Jesus is the light of heaven. Jesus is what makes heaven heaven. And even the gold, the things that we tell people when we tell them about heaven, you ought to go to heaven, brother. There's streets of gold. There's a gate of pearl. Even the gate of pearl and the streets of gold go, hey, yo, here, it ain't about me. I'm keeping it clear. And ultimately, if we want heaven to come to earth, that's what it should be about. Is the things that the world says ought to be valuable. We're like, no, I'm going to keep this clear. I may have this, it may be here, but I'm going to allow it to be translucent and transparent so that it never gets in the way of you seeing Jesus. Here's the thing I think. We are going to get to heaven and we're going to go, how in the world did our old life in our bodies feel real? It's almost like when you wake up from a dream and you go, how in the world did I really think I was about to die in that nightmare? You see all of these discrepancies. You ever notice that when you wake up from the dream, you realize how many things like you should have noticed were weird? You're like, I didn't notice that this scene changed and all of a sudden I was talking to this person and they became this other person. We're going to realize that when we get to heaven. We're like, why did we ever think that was more real than this?
It's true.
Heaven is infinitely more real than this world that we can hear, see, taste, touch, and smell. It's real life. It's not just floating on a cloud and wearing a diaper and playing a harp like a chubby little baby. That's not what heaven is. Heaven is 100% presence of God. And here's what makes me laugh. I talk to people all the time, and I think most Christians, at least, you would ask them, how excited are you about heaven? They'd be like, oh my God, I can't wait for heaven. So many Christians, I just can't wait to be in heaven. But yet they don't want to spend 30 minutes with God right now.
Yeah.
I can't wait to spend forever with God, but they don't want to spend 30 minutes with him right now. And so I think we're talking out of both sides of our mouth when we say that, but heaven is something we ought to long for. He has placed eternity in our hearts is what the scripture says. And yeah, we ought to long for heaven, but ultimately our mission is to bring heaven to earth.
Talking about heaven, there's no sickness. And a lot of people floating on the clouds with Jesus, like, oh, it's just this vague heaven type deal. But when you look at what heaven is, like, I mean, right now there's people in heaven, but there's still death. There's still the devil. There's still the enemy roaming around, right? There's two different realms, right? Heaven and then earth right now. But one day, Revelation, it says that Jesus will make a new heavens and a new earth, right? But in a baseline level of what heaven is, no sickness, no disease. You're spending time with Jesus. You're in the presence of God. God is light. God is the source of, like, the sun. You think of, like, he's dwelling amongst his people. He is the source of light. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong in this, in heaven we'll work jobs. Like in Genesis 1, Adam worked. And that was before the fall to when it waged war against him back. But like,
there just won't be toil.
Toil
is what we hate. Work is fueling. I mean, that's why you get in that flow state. You're working.
Exactly.
But it's fueling you, right? It's toil that is a product of sin.
And the people are like, oh, I don't really want to go to heaven because if we're just hanging out with Jesus, maybe that'd be boring. And people are naive who would say that, right? But some people think that, like, oh, I'd rather be drinking beer in hell with my buddies. You know, like, people have actually said word for word verbatim that before.
Oh, I know.
But they're so wrong because, number one, it's the fullness of what in Genesis, what God initially created for life to be working, dwelling amongst the people.
Yeah.
It's going to be a fulfillment of that one day.
Yeah. You know, the cool thing is when Jesus is hanging on the cross with the thief, right? And he's having that conversation. And the thief says, remember me when you come into your kingdom, right? That's what the thief says. Jesus doesn't say, today you will be with me in heaven. He doesn't say that. He says, today you will be with me in paradise. If you look at a study,
Yeah.
that word paradise means garden. Today, you and I will be in the garden. God is bringing it all back to where he had it in the first place. That's called redeeming, right? Redemption, bringing it all back and setting things to right. Ultimately, I mean, and I'm not limiting it to just like your idea of a garden, but it's utopic in nature, right? It is this idea of, I mean, for me, I'm going to let my inner nerd side out for half a second. I think Narnia, you know what I mean? When I was a kid, like that was my idea of heaven was Narnia, like these mountains and these waterfalls. I mean, I guess like New Zealand, because that's where they shot the Chronicles of Narnia. But I mean, it's just this incredible landscape.
One of the things that I always say a lot is that the best part of earth is worse than the worst part of heaven. And the best part of heaven is worse than the worst part of Jesus.
Wow.
You know, and we get to have Jesus here. So,
Yeah.
you know,
That's a version of in the Corinthians when he says the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of man.
Yep.
But it's a hypothetical.
there is no foolishness.
I know it's a
There is
hypothetical.
no-
It's to give you
as if there could
perspective.
be.
There is no bad side, right?
Exactly.
The point
It's a thought
is,
experiment.
Jesus is he is the focus of heaven, and we're excited about heaven.
Facets of heaven that appeal to each person. If you are somebody who's dealing with sickness,
Right.
there's no pain, there's
pain,
no
no
suffering.
suffering.
If you're
White
somebody who's naturally predisposed to depression, he will wipe every tear,
from your eye.
right? If you're somebody who in Psalms it says at his right hand there are pleasures forevermore. If you're somebody who is a party guy, was into drugs, was into that scene, there are pleasures forevermore. There are aspects of heaven that appeal to every person, but at the end of the day, Jesus is what makes heaven.
Well, I mean, think about this. You just said it. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. Who is at the right hand of God?
Exactly.
Jesus.
Exactly.
Jesus is our pleasure forevermore.
So many people, I think we can't get it twisted because so many people look at there are facts of the matter of what heaven is like because Jesus is there.
Right.
Because Jesus is there, because it's the perfect, it's the way we were designed to be. We were designed to be in his presence. We have been
Right.
redeemed. We went to the judgment seat of God. He said, you have the blood of the Lamb on you. You welcome in to the house. You know what I'm saying? And then now we're in the presence of Jesus like we always were intended to be. Now there's a fact of the matter. There's pleasures forevermore. There's no healing. I mean, there's no sickness. There's no depression. Every tear is wiped. But when we get it twisted and think that that's the prize, then we have it all wrong. And that's why what you said is so powerful about we don't want to get in our Bible for 30 minutes. Because what are we doing when we get our Bible for 30 minutes? We're spending time with Jesus.
Right.
What are we going to be doing with heaven? We're going to be spending time with Jesus.
Nonstop.
That's why heaven can invade earth. That's why heaven can be experienced today in terms of the presence.
Yeah.
Which Gerardo talked about so much on his podcast, talking about understanding the presence that Jesus is here in this room right now with us right now.
Without a doubt.
It's no different in heaven, except there will be fact of the matter differences that as a result of our environment.
Right.
But that's the premise of the understanding of how heaven can invade the earth.